Okay, in this video we're going to look at solving quadratic equations by using the square root method. So if we look at number 1, it says g of x equals x squared is a blank function, and find each of the following. Okay, so y equals, or g of x equals x squared, okay, that is what we're going to call a quadratic function. Okay, so if you go back to your previous chapter, okay, when you look at polynomials, okay, a quadratic function, you recognize that as ax squared plus bx plus c equals y, or f of x, or in this case g of x. So here we have y equals 1x squared. Okay, so that is in quadratic form. Okay, so if we look at following g of 2, so that algebraically, if you're looking at finding g of 2, that means whenever x is 2, what is the y value? So if you put 2 into your function, g of 2 will be 2 squared, which is 4. Okay, so we know that if you square 2, you get 4. If you look at the graph, g of 2 means that when x is 2, what is the y value? Well, we trace it up to this point right here, up to the y value of 4. Okay, g of negative 2, when you put negative 2 into your function, negative 2 squared means negative 2 times itself, so negative 2 times negative 2, which is, again, positive 4. And we can see on the graph, when x is negative 2, the y value on our graph is 4. So in part C now, we want to solve g of x equals 4. Well, again, what that's looking at is, where does x squared equal 4? Well, y equals x squared is your function that or our graph that we have here. And where do we get an answer of 4? Okay, meaning, what values can you put in for x to get a y value of 4? Well, we just found in parts A and B that when you substitute 2 and negative 2 into your function for x, you get 4. So we know the answer should be x equals positive or negative 2. Okay, so x equals plus or minus, okay, positive or negative 2. Now graphically what we're looking at is, if g of x equals 4, remember that's a fancy way of saying y equals 4. So the y value is 4 right here. So where does y equals 4 happen? Okay, at this point and this point, which is when x is negative 2 or when x is positive 2. So graphically, that's where we can see our answers. Okay, algebraically, we'll look at this down here. Okay, down a little bit farther. Okay, right now what I want you to think about is, when you square a number, it means you multiply by itself. So x squared equals 4 means, what number can you multiply by itself and get 4 for an answer? Well, if you do positive 2 times positive 2, okay, so if you did this, positive 2 squared, that gives you 2 times 2, which is 4. And if you do negative 2 squared, that means negative 2 times negative 2, which is also positive 4. Okay, part D, solve g of x equals 9. So that's saying x squared equals 9. So what x values can you substitute into your function to get 9 for an answer? Or what number or numbers can you multiply by itself to get 9? Well, we know that 3 squared gives us 9, okay, because 3 times 3. But also negative 3 will work. And if you look at our graph, a y value of 9 is way up here. So what x values would give you those y values? Okay, here and here. Well, at negative 3 and positive 3. So we know that x equals positive or negative 3. And again, positive 3 squared means 3 times 3, which is 9. Negative 3 squared would be negative 3 times negative 3, which is also positive 9. And I should point out, when you check that in your calculator, you want to make sure in our calculator, if we enter it like this, like if you want to do negative 3 squared, notice it gives us negative 9, but that's because your calculator is doing order of operations. It's doing 3 squared first to get positive 9 and then making your answer negative. So to get that right in your calculator, put parentheses around it. And if you want to square negative 3, it means negative 3 times negative 3, you have to enter it like this. Okay, and that's something that students miss all the time. Okay, it's a very common mistake. Okay, so if you want to square negative 3, this is how you do it with the parentheses. Okay, same thing on the graphing calculator if you use that. Okay, part E, solve g of x equals 25. So that's saying x squared equals 25. So what number of numbers can you multiply by itself to get 25? Well, positive 5 or negative 5. Okay, so x equals positive or negative 5. Now, unfortunately, on the graph, okay, to get 25, well, y value 25 would be way up here. Well, we don't see it on the graph, but what we can see is if you continue the shape on, okay, that U shape, okay, that quadratic function, and I should mention a name that we call that. You may sometimes hear the word parabola. Okay, that parabola, okay, this U shape or quadratic function, okay, we'll keep on continuing up and to the right this way, and I shouldn't say up because we're going to the left, okay, but it's going in this direction on the left-hand side. Okay, so eventually it hit 25 way up here, and where it would hit would be at an x value of negative 5, okay, that'd be way up here, and then positive 5. If you trace it up, it'd hit way up here. Okay, so positive negative 5. Okay, then g of x equals negative 4. So where do what x values can you substitute and get negative 4 for an answer? Well, what we're trying to solve is x squared equals negative 4. Okay, and this is a little trickier because what number can you multiply by itself to get negative 4? Well, if you're thinking negative 2 times negative 2 gives you positive 4, not negative 4. And if you're thinking, well, gee, Marts, what about 2 and negative 2? So 2 times negative 2? Well, that equals negative 4. That's true. But 2 and negative 2, they're not the same number. Okay, they're not the same number. So you can't use 2 and negative 2. Okay, so here, x squared equals negative 4. There is no number that you can multiply by itself to get negative 4, let alone any negative number. Okay, you can never square a number and get a negative answer. Graphically, what's happening is, where are the y values negative 4? Well, that's way down here. And does our parabola, our U shape, ever go through negative 4? No. So what we say here is the solution will be non-real. Okay, there's a non-real solution. Okay, so if we're looking at solving an equation like x squared equals c algebraically, like x squared equals 9 or x squared equals 25 or x squared equals negative 4, if you're trying to solve them algebraically, meaning show the work, okay, not just looking at a graph and seeing where they intersect. Okay, what we're looking at here is there an algebraic way to get our answer? Okay, so when we had x squared equals 9, okay, what you might notice is the square root of 9 equals 3. When we had x squared equals 25, you might notice that the square root of 25 equals 5. Okay, and that's because 5 squared gives you 25, and 3 squared gives you 9. So if you start with the 9 and 25 and take the square root, that kind of undoes the squared. Okay, you can kind of think of it that way. Okay, just like adding undoes subtracting, you can kind of think like a square root undoes a square, or squaring a number. So in general, if you have x squared equals c and you want to solve that algebraically, okay, what you do is, to undo the square, you'd have to take a square root. But what we notice is we get two different answers, though. We get the plus or minus. So when x squared equals 25, we got plus or minus 5. Well, if we solve this one, we would just have x equals the square root of 25 or x equals 5. Well, where did the negative come from? You have to actually add in yourself the plus or minus. And that's something that students forget all the time. It's the most common mistake I see on these, is people always forget the plus or minus part of this. Okay, but that is essentially how you solve x squared equals a number. You take x equals plus or minus the square root of that number. Okay, and if you can remember that plus or minus piece, then these are very easy to do. So number 2, solve algebraically x squared equals 36. So we follow that step. We have x squared equals a number, okay, just like right here, x squared equals a number. So x equals plus or minus the square root of that number. Well, can we find the square root of 36? So what do you multiply by itself to get 36? Positive 6. Okay, so x equals plus or minus 6. for x squared equals 100, x equals plus or minus the square root of 100. And what's the square root of 100? Is 10. So x equals plus or minus 10. X squared equals 6. So plus or minus the square root of 6. And then is there a nice perfect square that goes into 6, or is 6 a perfect square? Well, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, so there's not a perfect square for 6. Okay, so we're just going to leave it like that. If it said round to the nearest hundredth, we can go to our calculator and do the square root. Okay, square root is above the x squared button. Okay, you have to press second, okay, the second button before you do the square root. And then put in 6. Okay, and it gives me 2.449. So if I ask you to round that, okay, you can round that appropriately. Okay, I'll mention also on the if you go to mode and down to math print. Okay, so you highlight math print. Okay, what you might notice is if we try to do that, the square root of 6. Okay, notice how when we entered it, there was no parentheses around it, which is okay. But it didn't simplify, it didn't do anything to our answer. It just gave us square root of 6 back. If you're in the math type mode, if you press the double arrow button here, okay, that'll make it into the decimal. Okay, so if you press the double arrow, it'll go back and forth between the decimal and the exact value. Okay, and the second page here. Okay, this is just a bunch of practice ones. I'm not going to go over every single one with you, but I will put the answers up in a minute. So if we're looking at number 3, x squared minus 3 equals negative 2. Remember, the whole idea is to solve these equations algebraically, you want to get x squared equals some number, okay, some constant, okay, or just some number. So here, you have to add the 3 first. Okay, doing the plus or minus square root, okay, actually doing x equals plus or minus the square root of c, that is the last step every time. Okay, not the first step, it's always the last step when you're solving using the square root. Okay, so we have to add the 3 on this one first. So x squared equals 1. So now we have x squared equals a number. So x equals plus or minus square root of that number. And the square root of 1 is just 1. So if x equals plus or minus 1. Okay, if you take a second and do part B, okay, I'm just going to put the answer up there quickly because that's a fairly straightforward one. Okay, and notice you give the square root of 25, you get x equals plus or minus 5. Okay, on part C, this one you have to add 7 first. So when you add the 7, you get x squared equals 8. Okay, and then when you do plus or minus the square root of 8, okay, 8 is not a nice perfect square. Okay, it's going to be pretty close to 3. But if we go to our calculator, okay, and I'll show you here on our calculator, if we do, again in the mode, make sure you're in math print. Okay, if you're in math print, if you do the square root of 8, okay, it gives you 2 square root of 2. Okay, so what that does, it simplifies your square root for you. Okay, so we have x equals plus or minus 2 square root of 2. Okay, and then part D, if we have x squared plus 2 equals 4, we have to subtract the 2 first. So when we do that, we get x squared equals 12. Again, we have x squared equals a number, so we're going to solve it by doing x equals plus or minus square root of that number, which will give us plus or minus square root of 12. And if we put the square root of 12 in our calculator, that breaks it down to 2 square root of 3. Okay, so our solution there is x equals plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the rest of these with you. Okay, but I suggest that you pause the video because I'm going to put the answers up here in just a second. Okay, and then and try working on these and see what you come up with. Okay, and some of these you notice how, like in part C, we have negative 2x squared equals negative 200. Well, this one you need to divide by negative 2 first. So again, the whole idea is you want to isolate the x squared. X squared equals some constant. Okay, get it down to that, and then apply the plus or minus square root. Okay, so again, I'll pause the video and try to get the rest of these, and I'm going to put the answers up now. Okay, so here's the answers for A through F. Okay, there's nothing, I don't think, too crazy on these. You do have to be careful on part E down here. A lot of people forget to bring down the negative with the x squared. Okay, and then they get the wrong sign there. Okay, just got to watch your signs. Okay, and then on the last part, and the last row, we have x squared equals 4/9. Okay, so here what we want to look at is, what do you multiply by itself to get 4/9? Okay, so if we think about a fraction, when you multiply two numbers together and we end up with a fraction of 4/9, you'd have to multiply some fraction by another fraction. Remember, they have to be the same fraction because it's x squared. Okay, so you're multiplying the same fraction by itself. Okay, so if you think about it as, let me get the a blank one up here. Okay, so we look at it as, what can we multiply by itself? So like, what two fractions can we multiply by itself to get 4/9? Well, remember, when you multiply fractions, you multiply straight across. Not cross multiply, but straight across. So what do you multiply by itself to get 4? Well, 2 times 2. What do you multiply by itself to get 9? 3 times 3. Right? Okay, so what do you have to multiply by itself here? Is 2/3. Okay, so x equals plus or minus 2/3. Okay, another way to look at it is, if you do plus or minus the square root of 4/9, you square root the numerator and denominator. So square root of 4 is 2, square root of 9 is 3. Okay, on part H, similar to the ones on top there, now if you divide by 4, you get x squared equals 49 over 4, or 49 fourths. So there, x equals plus or minus. Well, what do you multiply by itself to get 49 fourths? Well, 7 times itself is 49, and then 2 times itself is 4. So x equals plus or minus 7/2. Okay, and then the last one, you have to divide by 9 first, because 9x squared. So divide by 9. So x squared equals 1/9. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 1/9. So what do you multiply by itself to get 1/9? Well, 1 times 1 gives you 1, and 3 times 3 gives you 9. So x equals plus or minus 1/3. Okay, so that's a quick video on solving using the square root method, and it's a fairly simple method to use once you get the hang of it and the idea of getting that plus or minus. Okay, and if you don't put the plus or minus there, okay, then that's pretty much half the credit off, because that's really the major concept here. Okay, so make sure you don't forget that.